William Shakespeare's The Tempest is a 17th century play about a powerful magician, as well as some members of his family, some of his old acquaintances, and some newer acquaintances. The magician has been banished from his home in Western civilization to a remote island full of fantastic and supernatural beings that he's enslaved and coerced into an elaborate plot to bring the other characters to the island with him, so that he can— oh, wait, I got my notes mixed up. This video is about Don't Starve. Sorry about that. Don't Starve is a survival video game franchise by indie game company Klei Entertainment, its first installment released in 2013. It's about a number of individuals from the early 20th century who found themselves trapped on a chain of dangerous otherworldly islands after making Faustian bargains with a magician named William Carter, known more commonly by his stage name, the Amazing Maxwell. The features of the islands are procedurally generated and highly interactive in an open-world manner similar to Mojang's Minecraft, where almost every object that the player can see can be removed, replaced, rebuilt, or refined into resources. Even objects that the player might have taken for granted as static, like the very ground you walk on. Also, like Minecraft, the game has no win condition. There's no way to undo the consequences of your character's Faustian bargain and return to Earth. The only escape is to other similarly perilous islands, and the only explicit goal is to survive as long as possible. However, Minecraft's punishment for failing to survive is sort of a slap on the wrist. On dying in Minecraft, you'll wake up in your bed in the home you've built for yourself, your inventory lost, but usually easily retrievable from wherever you died. By contrast, on dying in Don't Starve, you'll lose nearly all the progress you've made of any kind. Your inventory and all survival knowledge your character acquired are wiped, and Maxwell wakes you up on a new and unfamiliar island with no way to return to the old. This juxtaposition of fun and quirky creative conceits with harsh consequences is a recurring motif in the Don't Starve franchise, one that it inherits from the Tim Burton films that clearly inspired a lot of its audiovisual aesthetic, eccentric campy tomfoolery while engaging with such lighthearted topics as persecution, complicated grief for parents, serial murder, suicide, and the low points of otherwise illustrious acting careers.
What is he doing?
Auto weapon.
In this game, you can be a little girl struggling to come to terms with the trauma of her sister's untimely death for 1 minute, and the next use her sister's ghost as muscle to shake down anthropomorphic walruses for their fuzzy winter hats. You know how it goes. We've seen this kind of deliberate tonal dissonance in games before. In 1994, Shigesato Itui's Mother 2 came out, with its idyllic, picket fence suburban setting and its subtext about doomsday terrorist cults and sexual abuse. In 2003, Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker gave the Zelda franchise an innocent-looking makeover with its cel-shaded, painterly graphics and neotenous character designs, only to have them play out a story about the violent end of civilization. In 2007, Valve's Portal won universal acclaim for its humor and cheerful minimalism, as you progressed through a hazardous human-sized rat maze experiment under the direction of a crazy computer overseer.
Due to mandatory scheduled maintenance, the appropriate chamber for this testing sequence is currently unavailable. It has been replaced with a live fire course designed for military androids. The Enrichment Center apologizes for the inconvenience and wishes you the best of luck.
The popularity of tonal dissonance as a storytelling device in games hasn't exactly waned in recent years either, as we've seen from the success of Toby Fox's Undertale, with its story about genocide and existential dread wrapped in a colorful world of 8-bit nostalgia and friendly cartoon skeletons. And Undertale is just one of many recent games to use the 8-bit style, or to deconstruct assumptions about a seemingly facetious game genre's target audience. But dissonance isn't an end in these games, it's a means. They all have a theme they want to discuss, and tonal dissonance is a tool for that discussion. Mother 2 is a coming-of-age story, where the protagonist Ness has to learn about some uncomfortable realities of young adulthood as he emerges from the halcyon days of his childhood. The Wind Waker is an environmentalist parable, with shades of Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, where the antagonists want to restore civilization to its peak after an ecological disaster has set the world back. A noble intention that fails because they underestimate the power of nature to withstand mortal hubris, and ultimately give in to their ambitious, nostalgic dreams instead of accepting reality. Portal is a satire about corporate cultures that present themselves as normative and innocent while actually exploiting and dehumanizing their employees and customers. And it speaks for itself in that respect.
While it has been a faithful companion, your companion cube cannot accompany you through the rest of the test. If it could talk, and the Enrichment Center takes this opportunity to remind you that it cannot, it would tell you to go on without it because it would rather die in a fire than become a burden to you. Rest assured that an independent panel of ethicists has absolved the Enrichment Center, Aperture Science employees, and all test subjects of any moral responsibility for the Companion Cube euthanizing process. Destroy your Companion Cube or the testing cannot continue. Although the euthanizing process is remarkably painful, 8 out of 10 Aperture Science engineers believe that the Companion Cube is most likely incapable of feeling much pain.
Undertale has a meta-narrative that seems to be about how millennials can engage with charming video games from their youth in unintentionally destructive ways. Tonal Dissonance lends itself naturally to all of these themes because they all involve a conflict between perception and truth, or between what is and what ought to be. So the question I aim to answer with this video essay is, if tonal dissonance is a tool for discussing a theme, then what's the theme of Don't Starve? I'll have to answer that question in parts. Don't Starve is a game with remarkable writing quality, an idiosyncratic atmosphere and aesthetic style, and simple yet deep mechanics and world building. But if you search Don't Starve on YouTube, you won't find many videos dwelling for long on those qualities. More often you'll see speedruns or guides about optimal play. I have to give credit to Zeklo here for being the only popular YouTuber to speak at length about the lore of the game at all, but even he only covers lore in about 1/10 of his content. To a certain extent that's to be expected. Most of Don't Starve's story is buried, figuratively buried in puzzles and obscure character dialogue, or literally buried in graves, caves, naves, and under the waves. It's quite easy to play the game without realizing it has a story at all, and that's not a bad thing. Games can be memorable, high-quality experiences without stories, or with stories that are highly abstract, or with stories that are procedurally generated and had no human author. On top of that, Don't Starve is a game hyped for its excruciating difficulty, and it's not uncommon for the communities of games like that to focus on challenge and efficiency. Don't get me wrong, I love working out optimal play in good games, and I plan to do a lot of videos about it myself. But that doesn't need to come at the expense of discussing a difficult game's other virtues. We've seen a massive resurgence of games hyped for high difficulty this decade, and yet a fantastic YouTube channel run by VatiVidya has earned over 1 million subscribers just by giving intelligent analyses of the story and world building of Hidetaka Miyazaki's influential Soulsborne franchise, the series that began the perhaps questionable trend of gaming journalists describing any and all difficult games from 2012 onwards as Souls-like, or the Dark Souls of insert game genre here. I have a deep admiration for VatiVidya's work, and particularly for a few of his words about the intersection between a game's quality and its difficulty.
To some people, Souls is defined by literally only one thing: its difficulty. Because when you think about it, it doesn't matter if it has an ingenious story, it doesn't matter if it has deep combat, tight world design, and unique atmosphere. because those things might as well not exist at all if you can't get past the tutorial. The thing is, Souls isn't defined by its difficulty, but it is undeniably made better because of it. And I see a lot of people struggling to articulate why difficulty is good, and there's a lot of reasons, but I think the main one is that when good games are difficult, their mechanics are put to the test, and the player who succeeds at defeating the game will have properly experienced everything the game has to offer. Every mechanic will be used to its fullest.
I couldn't agree more. In the words of Maxwell, "This swift business I must uneasy make, lest too light winning make the prize light." Wait, sorry, that's The Tempest again. That's Prospera from Shakespeare's The Tempest, my bad. But in seriousness, Don't Starve's punishing reset, in returning you to square one upon death, does more than just encourage deep exploration of its mechanics. It gives every island value for its ephemerality, even as it forces you to deplete the island's resources to keep yourself fed and safe from the elements and predators. And this becomes another example of the motif I described earlier. It pits an emergent, idyllic beauty against a grim reality of unsustainability and entropy. The game never lets up with its passive aggression about the vibrant diversity and wonder that you're destroying. The intelligent native inhabitants of the island that you can exploit to fight your battles, chop your trees, hunt your food, or even become your food, all have procedurally generated individual names, which, emphasizes that you didn't just hurt a beast, you hurt a person called Lucius, or Olive, or Jamie, or Truffle, or Cheeky Chris, or Caligula? And hurting enough of them triggers a visit from infernal spirits of judgment that blend the punitive qualities of Satan and Santa Claus, though you can just fight them too for a properly absurdist mockery of justice, like Punchinello murdering the devil at the climax of a Punch and Judy show, with all the same upheaval of divine law enforcement that implies. You're rarely, if ever, allowed to see yourself as the good guy. Even hurting the less obviously intelligent animals comes with constant guilt tripping. But intense difficulty forces you to learn optimal play, and optimal play in this uncompromising wilderness means numbing yourself to an awful lot of casual cruelty. We all have our own ways of coping, I suppose. Don't Starve's predecessor, Minecraft, could be described as an empowering game. The end poem that the player receives for defeating the Ender Dragon declares, "The universe is kind," and that the players are special beings with the unique power to reshape reality to match their vision, both in the game and in real life. This is more or less consistent with the optimistic nihilism of Minecraft's creator, Marcus Notch Persson, and it parallels some truths of reality. Both Minecraft and the real world are composed of a simple set of ingredients that can be rearranged in complex forms to make almost anything we can imagine, whether those ingredients be Minecraft's Lego-esque virtual cubes or the real world's elementary particles. But real life doesn't give us free and easy access to these constituent pieces of reality in the way that Minecraft does. Nor does it give us infinite time and lives with which to do so. In this respect, Don't Starve is perhaps more existentially honest, with a universe that's unforgiving and largely indifferent to human ideas of kindness. One of the game's creators, Kevin Forbes, talked about this explicitly at a 2014 game developer conference.
Constant scarcity. The game is not about overcoming the environment. The game is not about becoming powerful and having this kind of power fantasy. Like we just made Shank 2, right? There's a cutscene where Shank dives into the ocean and rips a shark in half, and I think throws it at a helicopter and it explodes. So we'd had enough of that. I really wanted to explore other design areas. So what happens if you make a game where the character is really weak? What kind of feelings and emotions can you make in a game where the goal is not to overcome everything? And if you try to do that, you're probably going to fail and not kind of subvert the central meaning of the game, where it tries to tell you that life is meaningless and finite.
Good Don't Starve players are absolutely capable of overcoming the environment to an extent that Kevin Forbes probably didn't anticipate in 2014. with worlds that have lasted for thousands of real-world hours of playtime. But this is still only delaying the inevitable. The resources that the best players exploit to generate renewable food on a massive scale are all vulnerable to extinction given enough accidents or small mistakes over enough time, even if the amount of time it would take is enormous. Living requires constant active input, world loss is permanent, and that makes existence metastable at best. Extending the length of your stay is never completely free. Adventure mode in the first game tells a story of a quest to find and confront the great Maxwell for his deception in bringing you here. But the ending isn't a rewarding one. There's no climactic final battle and triumphant return home, because Maxwell was only middle management all along. He's a prisoner too, chained to his throne by supernatural beings that completely eclipse the individual agency of mortals. They'll show you terrible, beautiful things, he tells us. It's best not to fight it. There wasn't much here when I showed up, just dust, and the void, and them. I've learned so much since then. I've built so much. But even a king is bound to the board. You can't change the rules of the game. So what is Don't Starve telling us by taking the mechanics of an empowering game like Minecraft and using them to paint such a dismal picture of existence? I could wax existential here and say that it's about how, in a universe under the tyranny of forces that favor stable systems, power has a way of taking control in ways that we don't foresee. Once stable systems are set up, physical or social inertia can make them devilishly difficult to dismantle, and the removal of one abusive figurehead often changes far less about our situation than we dare to hope. But that would be a very abstract and self-indulgent way of hedging around the real point, which is that Don't Starve is about Western colonialism. I'm serious, by the way. In fact, it feels kind of weird to be the first person talking about this. If someone else beat me to it, and I missed you, please let me know and I'll credit you, but as of uploading this video, I still haven't seen anybody else taking this angle on the game. Maybe I'm crazy, but it seems so cut and dry to me. I see it in almost every creative decision the dev team has made. They chose to set their game in the early 20th century, with characters predominantly drawn from the United States and the British Empire, countries that were either on the cusp of being global superpowers or already well established as such. Countries notable for practicing some of the most extravagant imperialism of the time period in the name of manifest destiny, or American exceptionalism, or the white man's burden, as Rudyard Kipling put it. The devs also chose to fill the island's caves with the ruins of a dead culture that draws heavy inspiration from the native peoples of Mesoamerica, and they imply that this ancient civilization was brought low after they came into contact with Maxwell's otherworldly benefactors, which would make said benefactors into a sort of eldritch, Lovecraftian force of pillaging conquistadors. And that's still only the start of it. The player characters are only here in the first place because they accepted deals in which they were transported to another land under the pretense of helping them to fulfill various personal ambitions or facilitate their escape from persecution at home, which is, more or less, the experience that most immigrants, pilgrims, and refugees have had on arrival to the Americas. They come in search of religious freedom, or safety from dictatorship, or wealth and glory, and more often than not, they find less than was promised, and are victimized further, or survive by becoming agents of an oppressive system, or both. So long as we're on the subject of things that sound painfully familiar, I want to talk about a different piece of media that's often discussed in relation to colonialism, and that piece of media is Shakespeare's The Tempest. French psychoanalyst Dominique Octave Manoni published a book in 1956 called Prospero et Caliban, Psychologie de la Colonisation, and its ideas gained a lot of steam after they were discussed by giants of post-colonial studies like Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, to a point where the post-colonial interpretation of The Tempest is maybe the most common one now. This interpretation leads into a lot of similarities between Don't Starve's magician Maxwell and the Tempest magician Prospero beyond those to which I've already alluded. Both of them come to their enchanted islands with female companions, Maxwell's stagehand and lovely assistant Charlie, Prospero's daughter Miranda, and paternalistic protection of these female companions is what motivates a lot of their aggressive behavior. Both of them have a thing for sicking the dogs on their enemies. Both of them assume control of the island from a powerful and more dangerous predecessor, Maxwell from the Nameless Masters of the Constant and Prospero from the Algerian witch Sycorax. They both give their power away at the end of their stories. Maxwell cedes the Nightmare Throne to Wilson, Prospero breaks his staff and drowns his book. But they have their notable differences, too. Prospero isn't just a magician, he's also a nobleman. A duke, the ruler of Milan, born to power and privilege even without his magic. Whereas before Maxwell learned his magic, he was a desperate, starving artist. Prospero is banished because of the ambitions of overreaching conspirators, but Maxwell is banished because he himself is ambitious and overreaching. This makes Maxwell an update to the archetype that Prospero codified that's better fitted to his time and place. Like Vito Corleone, Daniel Plainview, or Walter White, he's corrupted by his own pursuit of the American dream, seeking his fortune and navigating the barriers of social mobility through luck and skill, only to end up creating new rules of oppressive order.
Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Oz. I said come back tomorrow.
I think that's a sensible modernization. Shakespeare probably intended for The Tempest to be set in the late 15th or early 16th centuries, at the height of the Duchy of Milan's power. And Don't Starve is set in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, so they both deal with about 100 years of history that preceded their publication, and their differences ought to reflect that. To be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that Klei developers consciously set out for Don't Starve to be a video game adaptation of The Tempest, but in a game this full of Shakespeare references, it's hard for me to imagine that the similarities to Shakespeare's story structure were ever far from their minds. Prospero's slave Caliban adds another angle to the allegory. Like the pigmen and the merms, Caliban's traits match with a lot of the pejorative characterization that colonists have tended to spread about native peoples. Vulgar, ugly, humanoid but not fully human, and, well, Shakespeare doesn't make this behavior explicit, but Caliban is very nearly an anagram of cannibal, and no discussion of colonialism is complete without touching on cannibalism. The word cannibal comes from a Spanish corruption of caribna, a word for person in the language of the Caribs of the Lesser Antilles. This origin for the word shows a tendency in European colonizers to project their own horror at the idea of consuming human flesh onto an exotic other. They exaggerate or even fabricate stories of savage cannibalistic rituals by the natives whose land they claim, but of course, in reality, Europeans and their descendants were frequent practitioners of cannibalism themselves. The Jamestown colonists ate each other during famine conditions in the 17th century, as did the survivors on the rafts of the Medusa and the Essex, the explorers of Franklin's Lost Expedition, and members of the Donner Party in the 19th century, and so forth. Cannibalism is shocking to a lot of people, and so it can make for popular penny dreadfuls and ghost stories, but it's nothing supernatural. It's just something that happens inevitably when people get desperate. The potential for cannibalism exists within every individual and every culture, and we keep it at bay for only as long as we don't starve. Anyway, this is relevant because there's so much cannibalism in this game that I can't even begin to cover all of it in one video. None of the island's creatures go out of their way to be cannibals, but it arises as an emergent phenomenon from the fact that most meat products are coded as the same item, so carnivores and omnivores will treat it all as the same stuff. You'll frequently see cannibalism from the pigmen, you'll see cannibalism from the spiders, you'll see cannibalism from the catcoons, and cannibalism from the depthsworms. Birds cannibalize their eggs, WX-78 cannibalizes parts from other robots. You can cannibalize the skeletons of dead survivors Maxwell brought in before you to make tools. In Don't Starve Together, it used to be possible to harvest other players for their edible flesh, before that was removed from the game for being too macabre. Funny where we draw lines sometimes. Even funnier is that the assets for human flesh are actually still in the game, so you can just spawn them in and eat them in console mode. It's worth noting how well cannibalism works as a metaphor for colonialism and imperialism. One culture assimilating another, the assimilator seeing more value in the assimilated as spare resources to be consumed than as personhood to be preserved. In most cultures where endocannibalism has been normalized, it's a little more respectful, a sort of grieving process or ancestor worship, where the essence of the dead is reintegrated into the community. But in general, it's way more common for cannibalism to be practiced either as a display of dominance or out of nutritional necessity. And the idea of nutritional necessity adds a whole nother layer to the discussion. Violent, involuntary annexation of less powerful nation-states or cultures by more powerful ones has often been justified as a necessary step in establishing coordinated centralized governments that ideally will raise quality of life for everyone. But whether or not the violence really was necessary tends to be a controversial historical subject, particularly in cases with unusually egregious war crimes or exploitation. For that matter, it can be controversial whether or not centralized governments actually raise anyone's quality of life at all. But wherever you stand on these kinds of political issues, you can probably agree that it's not raising the quality of life of the pigmen when you deliberately start civil wars to collect the meat and skin of their fallen, like some kind of depraved blood god. The commentary just keeps building as Klei releases new content. With Don't Starve Together, we started to see more depth to the relationships between the characters, and the emergence of means to engage with the seemingly unbreakable cycle of authoritarian despots on the Nightmare Throne. Game modes like The Forge and The Gorge have us visiting other worlds in the Nightmare Throne's shadow, and learning more about our situation, and that can involve the same aggression and displays of power that we're used to, or they can be more benign and helpful to the natives. But the really important thematic difference is that these game modes, though they are still difficult and take many failures to master, do actually have win conditions, though winning requires careful coordination with other players. This makes Don't Starve Together more optimistic than the other titles, since it implies that concerted effort by many concerned individuals can bring true change to broken systems. But the level of difficulty involved still makes it feel existentially honest, at least to me. That's also the impression I've been getting so far while playing Hamlet. Its pig civilization is no utopia, but it does offer more incentives to engage with pigs as equals, and more consequences for abusing their trust. We may be bound to the board, but we're bound on it together, and maybe we can build something beautiful here. Toward the end of his life, the renowned film critic Roger Ebert became embroiled in a passionate discussion of whether or not video games could be considered an art form. And although I disagreed with him on almost every level, I admired his sincere and respectful engagement with his opponents in good faith. One of the particularly interesting claims he made was, "One obvious difference between art and games is that you can win a game. It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome. Santiago might cite an immersive game without points or rules, but I would say then it ceases to be a game and becomes a representation of a story, a novel, a play, a dance, a film. Those are things you cannot win. You can only experience them." In this respect, it's possible that Roger Ebert might not have considered classic Don't Starve to be a game, as it lacks win conditions, but he definitely considered chess to be a game. Chess is one of the oldest and most respected games in human history. Its rules are very simple, but its depth is tremendous, which makes it a perfect example of one of the ideals of good games, to be easy to learn and hard to master, also known as Nolan Bushnell's law. This minimizes the initial frustration of learning good fundamentals, while simultaneously creating high replayability and great rewards for experienced players. There are more possible unique games of chess than there are atoms in the observable universe. Don't Starve abides by Bushnell's law as well. It has a very simple set of objectives, but allows for a very deep, emergent experience through the unpredictable interactions between the cycles of its procedurally generated systems. The growth of trees, the attacks by hounds, the changing of the seasons, and the relentless depletion of the player's stomach. Roger Ebert was very enamored of Bushnell's law-abiding games like chess, but even so, he was sort of on the fence about calling them art. Santiago concedes that chess, football, baseball, and even mahjong cannot be art, however elegant their rules. I agree, but of course that depends on the definition of art. She says the most articulate definition of art she's found is the one on Wikipedia. Art is the process of deliberately arranging elements in a way that appeals to the senses or emotions. This is an intriguing definition, although, as a chess player, I might argue that my game fits. Wikipedia has updated this definition now, by the way, to be a lot vaguer and more inclusive, so Wikipedia editors are on the fence too, it would seem. This video isn't arguing for or against a particular definition of art, just making observations about trends in how those definitions arise. Chess is not the only game to attain such a lofty status. The aforementioned mahjong has a complexity-to-depth ratio that's just as good, if not better than chess's, as do Go and certain variants of Mancala. But chess has two qualities that set it apart from these other games. The first is that, while chess is believed to have originated in India, in modern times it has come to be strongly associated with the West. The second is that, unlike these other games, chess is not purely abstract. Chess has unique pieces with a hierarchy of importance, while Go and Mancala do not. Mahjong has a hierarchy of pieces, but its hierarchy is not specifically explicitly modeled on feudalism in the way that chess's hierarchy is. Chess, in short, tells a story, and that story is one of imperialistic competition between two kingdoms. And, of course, chess is also featured prominently in both Don't Starve and The Tempest. In Don't Starve, it's a recurring motif. It appears with the Clockwork and Shadow chess pieces, with Maxwell as king and Charlie as queen. In The Tempest, it's a bonding ritual for the young lovers Ferdinand and Miranda. The play has a backdrop of strife and political intrigue between Naples and Milan that led to Prospero's exile, but in that moment between Ferdinand and Miranda, the children of Naples and Milan's leaders at innocent play, the real-world competition between their homelands becomes a game. Ferdinand and Miranda are probably the most wholesome Shakespearean romantic couple. Other couples bicker, or enable each other's unscrupulous schemes, or commit double suicide, or even murder-suicide. But Miranda and Ferdinand just play chess. And while there's obviously some potential to read innuendo there, it's a very satisfying way to portray a relationship, even if you read it literally. Because playing good games with people you like, or people you love, is such an intimate experience. I can't help but notice how, despite the game's ridiculously high cruelty potential, the community of Don't Starve Together seems full of friendly sweethearts, especially by the standards of online multiplayer games in general. Not so bad for people bound to a board. Anyway, this is the part where I wrap up my pretentious rambling by shamelessly plugging 3 new series. Ideally, I'll release episodes of them concurrently with The Adventures of Wendy and Friedrich, but I can shift focus around a little depending on viewer preference. One of them will be a run in which the goal will be to cause every possible instance of cannibalism that can occur in the game. The second will be an Undertale-style pacifist run, in which the goal will be to build a decent base and clear the ruins, without killing anything, and without indirectly arranging for anything to be killed using traps or minions. The last will be more episodes like this one, focused on analysis and lore instead of gameplay, but like I said, it's subject to change based on feedback. I care a lot about you folks' thoughts, so As always, don't hesitate to speak up in the comments. Later!